Yep.
All right. I think we're 9:30 or 10:30. So I think we're ready to go. All right. Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's coffee talk. My name's Sean O'Brien, and as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the Director of Analytics here at Quick Rate and Quick Analytics. I spent my entire career working with community financial institutions in a range of different functions. And I've spent a little over a decade here now with Sean and Quick Rate and building the tools and services that you see in front of you today.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And we're welcoming back Paul Allen from Saltmarsh. Paul has been gracious enough to join us again. Some of our best attended coffee talks have been when Paul has joined us. So we welcome Paul back. And Paul, if you want to just introduce yourself to our group.
Well, I'm just very honored and pleased to be with you, Sean. Thanks so much. Enjoy the conversations that we have. I have the opportunity to spend 100% of my time with financial institutions and truly appreciate the opportunity to talk about how we get through the drama with CECL. So,
well, thank you very much, Paul, for again not only being a friend, but to all of us, but also joining us on these coffee talks. All right. So, just a reminder. I think obviously all of you know this, but I just will share it. The Q&A box and the chat are the best ways to submit any questions while we're speaking through our prepared remarks, and then we'll monitor those and try to certainly address all of those that come in during today's presentation. Again, I think what we've hopefully found and you have found is we thought, there's going to be an evolutionary process to CECL. So we didn't want you to have to go it alone. And so we know throughout this, there have been questions, and we felt like one of the best ways to try to address these were through this forum. So not only could we answer a question, but hopefully share knowledge share that with the rest of our credit union. So we hope you found this forum to be effective, and we'll continue to do this as we move through the year. Excuse me. So last month and this month, we've touched on and will continue to make enhancements and updates to our tool, whether it comes from feedback from you directly, from third parties, from educated users like Paul. We're trying to just stay current, and if we think there's an enhancement or improvement or a best practice we can incorporate into the CECLSolver, we are going to continue to do that. So you can see just a few bullet points of what we've done to this point and are working on. A reminder that the slide deck and a link to the recording will be available to you next week. And we do have a few poll questions we're going to get to here in a second. All of that will be available and sent to everybody who registered, in an email early next week. So we're going to jump into the polling questions. You've all been gracious enough to answer these, in the last couple of months. This will again be something we try to do each month, but we do have a few that we want to again revisit today. The first one being, have your external auditors or regulatory examiners reviewed and made recommendations about your CECL calculations? So we'll just give this a little bit of time for everybody to address. But Paul, I don't know if you have any comments just about the external process you want to share at this point.
well, certainly the external auditors at this point, they audited right before we implemented. And so they're technically not auditing usually at the end of your fiscal year, the CECL, but they probably look over your shoulder and to see what you've done, because often we in a footnote disclosure will talk about new accounting pronouncements and what the anticipated effect is. So we're really asking whether your external auditors, as part of their most recent audit, or any regulatory examiners have looked at it. Sean, I think we also have a question about internal auditors, which is next.
Yep. So 61% of you haven't had any external requests. 11 have and made some recommendations, and 28% have been reviewed, but no recommendations. So thank you for sharing that. We'll move on to the next question here regarding model validation and review. Have you had your internal auditors or consultants perform a CECL model validation review? Were there any significant recommendations from that review? Paul, I don't know if you want to share your comments here then.
So this is probably a little bit more common, that someone has perhaps either at the implementation date or as of the March quarter actually looked at how the implementation went and how the model is being run. So this is usually done by an internal auditor, or if you outsource your internal audit function, a consultant. And again, they're looking over the shoulder to make sure that, you know, the management team has actually implemented the model and started using the model. And generally speaking, there is regulatory guidance already in existence about model validation. We usually validate a model the first time through, and then with any changes. So we can see there from the results, Sean, it's early on yet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So 89% have not yet stepped through there. A few people have had that done. There's not a requirement to have it done at any particular point in time, but it's certainly expected and best practice that you'd probably expect to have that in the first year of implementation to make sure that you got off on a good footing.
Great. All right, so we'll move on to the next question regarding your reserve. This is one we've asked each month and will continue to, but do you anticipate increasing or decreasing your reserve over the course of 2023? So again, we'll just give this 30 seconds or so to allow you to answer. All right, so this one's a little bit more evenly balanced. Yes, 54% of you anticipate increasing your reserve. 7 anticipate decreasing the reserve, and 39% don't expect any significant change. So thanks for sharing that. Just a couple more. The economic factors, we've asked this one before, but are you increasing or adjusting your economic factors due to discussions about possible recession and or the anticipated adverse change in the credit cycle? So we'll give this 30 seconds or so.
John, is that a mythical adverse change in the credit cycle? We're all talking about that the credit cycle is turning bad, but boy, it has not shown up in the numbers yet, has it?
It has not. All right, so 63% do anticipate an increase, and 37% say no. So thanks again for sharing that. And our final question then are around the unfunded commitments. Just again, we're early on this, but how are you handling and monitoring the loss or the reserve on unfunded commitments? We probably mistyped that, but reserve on that. We should have worded that better. But anyway, I think everybody understands the question and then the choices. So we'll give this again just 30 seconds or so.
You never let me vote on these polls, Sean.
Yeah.
It says that I'm not allowed to
thinking
vote.
the same thing, Steve. I wanted to vote.
And so while actually we're going to get to that question from Brian here. I think this one's probably right off the bat we should address. So let me go ahead and end this poll. So 59% of you using the template we have in the CECLSolver, 3% are using their call report numbers times a loss factor, 4% using their call report numbers times an estimated funding percentage and loss factor, 0% flat dollar amount, and 33% of you have no separate reserve established. So again, thank you all very much. We will include this in the email that we send out next week with the slide deck. So this, I think this question, is worth addressing because we do get it frequently. And again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding upon validation and the kind of the bifurcated process here that's required. So the question is, will CECLSolver have an independent validation performed so that all clients need not repeat the process individually? So I'm going to just jump in here and say we do have a SOC 1 already as part of our resources, but Paul, you'll do a better job as an external auditor explaining the responsibilities of the financial institutions beyond what we as a model or a solution provider provide.
Yeah, the regulatory guidance about all models, because we use models in different part, but the point of the validation, model validation, that word independent, first of all, means that it's done by someone independent of the activity. So it can't be the model provider, and it can't be the person at the institution that actually on a daily basis runs and is responsible for the model. So it has to be done independently to make sure that it's going through. The model vendor, in this case, CECLSolver, will generally provide some kind of a SOC report that says, hey, within the model, the math works. Anytime you put 2 + 2 in this model, it works. So that is the model itself works. However, to do a model validation, you also have to consider, did the institution's data get correctly put into the model? So that's done on an individual institution basis. Are the assumptions that are used in the model, the institutions, they apply to the institution, are they reasonable for the institution? Are they properly approved by the governance within that? And then finally, do the reports go to the correct person for governance? So each institution has to ask themselves, has someone outside independent, perhaps someone in the institution or a third party, but someone that's not from the vendor or involved in the running of the model, are they looking over and saying, is the institution's data going in? Are the assumptions reasonable? The model vendor can give us an independent SOC report that says the math works, but that SOC report is true of any data, not your data. So someone has to check and see if your data is used. So the tough answer to that, Sean, is I'm afraid every institution has to do something about considering, is this model being used correctly? What do we think about the vendor? In your case, CECLSolver is a well-regarded, reputable vendor. There's a SOC report, so the model works, but then someone has to check to see that your data is going into the model, your assumptions, and the reports are given to the correct person so that they can be asked on. So there's a partial answer that CECLSolver does do something for all institutions by giving them that SOC report. That's a beginning point, but each institution will have to do something with regard to making sure that your data in particular is being put in correctly, mapped correctly, correct assumptions, and proper governance. And so that process is probably going to require some effort on every institution. And often the institution doesn't have enough folks at the institution that can be knowledgeable about this, but don't actually get involved in it. So it's often turned out to the internal audit department or your outsourced internal audit function. So Sean, that's probably too much. I apologize.
No, that's perfect, Paul, because I was going to say then, like we were talking before, you've done, independent validations of tools like ours and others, but really the choice for the institution is that, again, if they can find somebody in their own internal audit team or somebody separate from the people running the tool, it can be performed and done in-house.
That's correct.
But they could also turn to someone like your firm and hire you to do a validation on their behalf as part of that process as well, correct?
And we've done quite a few of them so far this year since implementation. And I don't want to tell what other auditors ought to do or anything, but generally speaking, it's a 3-day to 1 week. So budget of 24 to 40 hours of the consultant's time, and you can figure out what your vendor, what your outsourced person uses as an hourly rate, and get an idea of the cost of that. But it's not testing every number. It's looking at a sample of numbers, tracing those into your GL or your call report. And Steve, I think CECLSolver does a pretty good job of helping that review process by giving, good understanding of how those numbers go into the model and how they're used and so forth. And I'm sure, Steve, that's going to continue to evolve, that there'll be more and more tools to get into, to provide the pathway, the audit trail, if you will.
Always foreshadowing, Paul.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. And we are, and to Paul's point, we are working, Steve is diligently working on an Excel-based tool that hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll be able to show you to assist you should you want to go down the path of doing it independently, in-house, or even potentially for your third party. We're just trying to make that process easier. Again, we can't do it for you, where we are working to try to make it easier, whether it's you or someone else to do it. So more to follow on that, but we understand that this is something a lot of you are being asked of, and so we are working to address it as best we can from the role we have. Okay, so moving on, we have, and as we touched on, we're going to continue to make enhancements. I think one we touched on last month that, again, since it's new, we're going to try to just probably keep touching on for a little bit here. But, it's just some flexibility within the look back period. So Steve, I'll let you touch on it, and then I don't know if you want to take the screen or not. You just let me know.
No, I think we can do it right here in the PowerPoint environment. And you can go to the next screen, and we'll look at the nitty gritty of it. So this enhancements, again, we talked about it, I believe, for the first time last month. One of the assumptions that we made initially in building our tool, with guidance from the NCUA and FASB as well, was to link the look back period, or the length or duration of the look back period, with the WARM, or the remaining life of the portfolio. And that was done for a number of reasons. One being, it's the simplest way to do it. It's the most straightforward way to do it. It's the easiest way to follow. And the math is a little bit more straightforward as well. It's also a universally pretty good assumption to make, unless you have kind of abnormal or kind of different than the norm situation. But we've have a lot of users using our tool now. So we've come across a lot of very kind of unique situations where an institution has had very good justifiable reasons for wanting to have some more flexibility in the look back periods, and kind of separating the length of a look back period from the length of the WARM, or the remaining life of the portfolio. One great example is if it's a younger credit union that doesn't have 10 years worth of historical results, but has a relatively long remaining life on, say, their mortgage loans. If you need 10 years worth of data to do a 10-year calculation, and you only have 8 years of existence, that's a problem. That's just one of many examples. And so what we've done is added some additional functionality, so that if you wanted to, quote, break the link between the WARM and the look back period, or the length of those two, you can do that. You can, for example, say, I have a 9-year remaining life on my mortgage loans, but I only really want to use a 3-year historical period to drive my loss expectations moving forward. You can now say, I want a 3-year look back period. I'll have to do some extra math to turn that into a 10-year expected loss rate, right? A 10-year lifetime loss rate, or vice versa. If you have a relatively short weighted life, let's say a construction portfolio that has, or your credit card loans that have, less than a year remaining life, but you want to take into account a longer historical period, more cyclical period in calculating your rate, we can calculate a shorter rate and then multiply that to make it a lifetime loss rate that's or sorry, a longer look back period, and then divide it up to make it an appropriate lifetime calculation. All that being said, if you like the way the tool works currently, or the way the tool has always worked, you don't have to do any of this additional. It will still continue to work exactly as it always has, with the same lifetime and duration of warm and duration of look back being linked together. But now you have some more flexibility in that regard, and that also opens up more flexibility in how you want to handle historical loss rates versus qualitative factor adjustments, right? The two big pieces of math or the puzzle in CECL is what would history suggest my losses need to be over a lifetime, and why do I think it might be different in the future, right? So if you want your historical time frame to be relatively tight and short and current, and handle things outside of that shorter duration that might happen cyclically as part of your Q factors, you have more flexibility in doing that. Or if you say, I want my Q factors to be bare bones, I want as much of it to be built into the history as possible, then you can take maybe a longer look back period and try to capture some more losses from the last credit cycle that we had, even though that now is more than a decade old. So it gives you more flexibility and options from that perspective. Again, all optional if you choose to use them.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Steve. All right. Again, we had a question come in. It's actually a thoughtful one. I'll let Paul answer it. But the question came in from George. Can Credit Union A perform an independent review of model for Credit Union B and vice versa? Paul, is
that... certainly you can do that, assuming two things. Number one, the person that's doing the review is actually competent. So, I mean, you can't use a teller, for example, at one place just to say, well, we'll check the box. So they have to be competent and independent. And unfortunately, often the very people that are knowledgeable and competent to understand and walk through a CECL model, it's just not often the best use of their time because they're usually swamped. And so if you can find the CFO of one credit union that has enough time to look at another credit union and do that, that would be acceptable. Again, as long as they meet the knowledgeable and competent and independent. But we do find that typically that's just quite honestly not the best use of their time. So it's often outsourced to a firm or an outsider that's all they do, and so they can kind of do it frequently. Another issue is that at the end of the validation, there has to be some report produced of what was done, and so sometimes you might have someone who knows models completely, but they don't have an established report that they can pull up and prepare and so forth. So it becomes more burdensome to someone that doesn't do that frequently. So it's again, it's probably just going to become, for a lot of institutions, just another internal audit review that's done, and it's probably going to be done on a frequency that it would be done in the first year after the model implementation, and then periodically thereafter. And certainly anytime you change models, you do it. But yes, you could do that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for the question. Okay. So Steve, here, if you want to, do you want to touch on just?
Yeah, I do. And just before everyone gets too excited, this is all very preliminary, and we're starting this process. And as you can see, some of the segmentation is more appropriate to commercial banks because we have a version of it for commercial community banks as well as credit unions. But the concept here is our interactive tool, as it stands now, we've already provided sort of a call report, a full complete Excel-based data export, right? Which was the first step in providing you some ability to do some internal validation and recreation calculation of some of the numbers in the tool on the interactive tool. And that right now, if you go to the export button in the tool and you go down to the bottom of it, there's a detailed Excel quarterly data export, which gives you all the call report information, every single line item in the call report going all the way back in time that is used in our interactive tool. The gap there that still exists is, all right, well, now I can spot check my call report versus this Excel export you guys have given us. So I know that the values that go into the tool do come from the call report and they are accurate. However, there's still a lot of math going on here between getting from a call report number to getting to a lifetime historical loss rate on a 4-year look back period for a 6-year warm, right? There's still a lot of steps that go in there, mathematically speaking. So our kind of next generation attempt to provide more assistance to make it easier for your internal audit or external audit or whoever might be tasked with additional model auditing and validation to save them time and energy and money, is to provide something along the lines of this, which will be based upon our Excel add-in. We have a tool that's part of our analytics package that allows institutions to pull data directly into Excel without having to log into the interactive tool separately. We're going to utilize that functionality to kind of pull all the data into Excel like our export currently does, but then provide the additional math that's done so that you can see how we're calculating and exactly what steps are being taken mathematically to get to the lifetime loss rates. The concept for this tool would be that, as you can see here, this looks a lot like your historical analysis tab, right? You have balances, charge-offs, recoveries, net charge-offs, historical, annual summaries, and then some choices for the look back period. And then all the way on the right, it calculates the lifetime losses and lifetime loss rates. That's the value that then goes on to becoming your CECL calculation, right? After we apply Q factors. So the concept here is that this Excel tab would link to a raw data one, and then this would look identical to your historical analysis tab, but you'd be able to follow the math at any point backwards and forwards. You'd also be able to type in your warms from a scenario. So you would be able to open up an existing scenario, copy your warms from that scenario into the Excel tool, make sure the look back periods match, and then all the values from here would perfectly match what it is in your tool. Now, it's a challenging task, especially given the wonderful changes that everyone knows about that that the NCUA made last year in the call reports, changing all the segmentation and buckets for loss reporting. And that made the data requirement for any of this kind of stuff exponentially larger, which was, but that's my challenge, not yours. And so that's why it's a process that'll take a little bit of time for us to clean it up and get it to you. But this is the anticipated result of this next kind of project that we're working on right now. John?
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and I think part of, again, we hear, what you are experiencing and being requested of. I mean, I was at a regulatory panel this week, and the head of the NCUA, even for their tool, right, they recognize they need to be able to provide, tools for people to independently validate. And so they're doing a similar thing, right? So this is just something that, regardless of what solution you use, is unfortunately can be a request, to all of you. We did have a question.
Well, I forgot about this. So in addition to just audit validation support, we've had lots of requests over time for, well, we know we can update our current balances. We can modify our current balances. We can exclude government guaranteed stuff. We can exclude balances from our current loan portfolio that we don't need to calculate a CECL reserve on, right? Whether it's government guaranteed, whether it's, fully share secured. If we need to split something off because of another custom risk pool and then go back into time and historically modify all the balances, the interactive tool can't support that. And it would be so overwhelmingly unwieldy that you wouldn't want it to. This environment would allow more of that flexibility. You could go back in time and modify historical balances for a particular segment, strip them out of that segment to have historical long-term trends for custom risk pools. More support for a merger an acquisition that you might, now they're talking about some new and different accounting rules, surprise, surprise, for like the second or third time, on how to handle acquired loans specifically from a reserve standpoint, right? So additional flexibility depending upon what they come up with and how they want us to do that might be something that's important for our customers that have done acquisitions in the past. So this will have some more flexibility from that standpoint as well, and satisfy some of those kind of less common but more complicated needs. Sean?
Yeah, and again, thank you, Stephen. I think again, we're trying to just be responsive to, again, what we think you need, what you're being asked to do, and just as we move forward, give you more flexibility and potential options. We did have a question come in, I think, regarding the NCUA's tool, if there's a threshold for whether it's not recommended, and I think 50 or 100 million is the number that's coming to my mind, but I don't honestly know that for sure.
It's 100. Even in the NCUA announcement about the simplified tool, in their very description of it, they said it's intended for institutions less than 100 million. So by their actual announcement, where you go to download the tool in the introduction to that, that is their suggested guideline. It would be intended for less than 100 million.
And that drives their data research as well. The NCUA all that data that we now have from the NCUA as far as default warm values, default prepayment rates by loan segment and all that. They didn't undertake that process of gathering all that data and updating it on a quarterly basis internally. They outsourced that to some sort of third party, and that third party is in charge of that. But they did mention in the notes that all of it was designed to capture data for credit unions under 100 million in assets. So when you see all the peer numbers that the NCUA provides as far as warms and prepayments and everything, it is for some sort of sample of credit unions all under $100 million in assets.
Right.
Perfect. Okay, so just some ACL trends I wanted to share. I was again recently at the FMS conference this past week. It had all representatives from all the interagency departments. The head of the NCUA was there. And so he just, had a little bit of commentary regarding CECL adoption. And I think the interesting thing that I took from it, was just the fact that they, the net worth ratio had decreased. For all credit unions, but over 500 million, there was a 25 basis point decrease. The other thing was, and I think Steve's gonna touch on this, but then they had just kind of seen, some, increases, the ratio decrease was, in large part tied to increases, or I shouldn't say it that way, but they also saw, increases in the reserves. I think all of the regulators on the panel, talked about the fact that one of the things about CECL that was different from the incurred loss was the expectation for us to be forward looking. And I think they all were in agreement that they said now is not the time to be complacent. So they were anticipating and in some ways almost expecting that they would see increases in the reserve throughout the year. Take that for whatever it's worth. But, again, when all of the agency heads were, or representatives from all the agencies were there on a panel and they were sharing that, I felt like it was something that was worth sharing, to our users as well. Okay, the next one, just Steve, I think you had some numbers in here last month, and again, we're going to try to, as we go forward in each of these share more information with all of you. So take it away, Steve.
Yeah, sure. So there's some joke that's eluding me about statistics that I can't think of off the top of my head right now, but it reminded me what you were just saying, Sean, that they anticipated and expected some sort of an increase, but how much that increase would be remained to be seen. Well, the median reserve to loans, or now ACL, sorry, to loans, for all credit unions between 100 and 500 million in the country. So it's about exactly 1,100 credit unions that are between 100 and 500 million, jumped from 50 basis points in the fourth quarter to 62 basis points. So there's two ways you might look at that. I might say that's only a 12 basis point increase. I also might say that's a 20% increase, right? So depends on if you want to be optimistic or pessimistic about it, but it was about 50 basis points was kind of median reserve to loans in the industry for that size credit unions. And it jumped up, 12 basis points over 50. So that's what, almost 25%, but it's only actually 12 basis points on the whole loan portfolio. I showed higher and lower too. So you can see now, only 10% of credit unions now have under 25 basis points reserve, and 10% have over 1.33%. So those numbers on the margins have kind of increased as well. But that's pretty much the impact that we've seen from specifically from the change in. Now you can't say it's only from the change in methodology. Obviously, it's not like the economy's done nothing over the last few months. There certainly are different pressures going on from an interest rate, from a recession, from all those other perspectives. But and maybe Paul can shed some light on those. But that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, Sean, it's just fascinating to me if you go back and think about what everyone thought would happen when CECL was first discussed or proposed. At that time, we were coming off the 2008 to 2010 economic downturn, and there was a lot of speculation that the reserves in the industry would be north of 2%. And, the impact of this great long bull credit market that we've had, where we've had so little charge-offs and problem loans really in the last few years, has resulted in us not having to book, nearly that level of reserves, which is very reassuring. But I will go back to, your comments. The regulators expect us to be forward-looking, and so there's a great deal of economic uncertainty, certainly in 2023. And so, we're hoping it not to get a lot worse, but everyone is expecting that the credit cycle has already turned and turned worse. We just haven't necessarily seen it in the numbers yet. So I think it's totally reasonable for that little bit of a bump between 12/31 and where we are in March. Looking forward to kind of watching that. Yeah. And certainly we're all rooting for all of our friends in Washington to guide us to a very soft landing, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But I think it is. I mean, I think that's well said, Paul. And again, I think that was one of the takeaways that I had from the regulatory panel is that, the big difference between the incurred loss and CECL was this forward-looking thing. And so that's why, again, they just, their brief comment was simply, now is not the time to be complacent. So again, their words, not mine, but take that as you will. So, I think, again, as we kind of move forward here and to get close to the end of, the second quarter, and we'll start filing call reports for and preparing potentially quarterly, reserve analyses, we just might share, and Paul, maybe you can share a little bit what your team has seen, from institutions so far with CECL, and we can just talk about anything to be cognizant of as we move forward in this kind of evolution of CECL.
Well, certainly, as we've performed quite a few of the reviews or model validations as an outsourced internal audit, and one of the things that we've been looking at is there's been generally most people use a look back period equal to the warm calculation, the estimated life. But there is some discussion about whether that's always the best practice. And as Steve mentioned, having a flexibility to perhaps consider or think about using something longer or shorter than the warm calculation might make sense for your particular loan portfolio. So that is a very useful tool to look at. The other thing that we're starting to see a little bit of discussion about is on the qualitative factors. Each layer of our loan portfolio has different risk attributes. And so we certainly would not expect residential loans to react to the same things that perhaps auto loans or credit card loans or commercial loans. And so if you use the qualitative factors, calculate them one set and use them for all loan types, that's starting to raise a couple of eyebrows. Is that really appropriate? Should you have qualitative factors that are slightly different for each layer, if you will, or component of your loan portfolio? So I think that will get, more and more attention as to whether, what the qualitative factor should be by each, for each one. The tool, Steve, that you were talking about and developing that provides an audit trail is very, very helpful, because I think we're going to continue to have some discussion about, how is the weighted average remaining maturity calculated? Specifically what goes into that calculation. And so having those tools where you can demonstrate and test that, and the historical loss calculation the same way. So those are important. And I guess finally, Sean, we would all say that there's no credit risk in Treasury securities. And yet in the last month, we've seen an historically unusual period of time with the debt ceiling controversy, in which it became close to having some credit risk in those. So while it's easy for us to say we don't have to think about credit risk on the held to maturity, I do encourage all institutions to perhaps on a quarterly basis have a short memo about why you think there's no credit risk in your securities portfolio. And you have the tools to do that every quarter, and in the ALCA run and annually on municipals, there's a credit analysis. So you have all the tools. And I'm not asking Sean for, a long narrative. I just think it's probably helpful for you to be able to document that you've at least intentionally considered whether there's credit risk in the securities portfolio, and then simply document that. And that documentation may be pretty similar quarter to quarter, but I encourage you to do that, because I think just a shrug and say, well, we all know that there's no credit risk in securities, I think that's probably not going to get it on as we go forward. Certainly, the first thing to do was to get through the CECL implementation and look at credit risk in the loan portfolio. But I think that as we evolve this, we'll get more and more thought process of simply documenting your thought process. Why do you not have to pay attention to this? What's your thought process? The encouraging thing is we have all that information in the ALCO packages and in the bond accounting reports. It's just a case of actually, lifting that out as a narrative. Does that make sense, Sean?
Absolutely. That's really helpful and insightful. So thank you very much, Paul, for that. Steve, anything you want to add just as as the credit unions get ready here for the second quarter call reports?
No, nothing in addition to what Paul said comes to mind.
Okay, great. All right. Well, that gets us to the end of the prepared marks today. If there's any additional questions, go ahead and submit those now. Otherwise, again, we'll be working to, again, just feedback. Steve will be working on the enhanced Excel tool for you to utilize. We will be back again next month with another presentation in July, again, where we'll hope everybody will probably be in the midst of completing their call reports. So we'll talk about, issues as we get close to the filing period. But in the interim, if you have any questions, certainly reach out to David or Jason. Email us at info@quickrate.com with any questions. But otherwise, I'll let Steve and Paul, if any final comments.
Yeah,
before we
one
let our-
final thought. And it goes back to what we were discussing earlier, in especially when it comes to filing your next quarter and updating your analysis for the next quarter. Let some of that feedback that you've been getting and pushback, if any, that you've been getting from auditing and from regulators help drive whether you want to take advantage of some of the additional flexibility that the with the look back period modification. If you have had almost no loss in a segment over a 5-year period, your entire reserve from that segment is coming from qualitative factors. And no matter how much justification you feel like you're giving, they're pushing back for more. Then you can take the opportunity to look back and see if you had some losses further back in time that you'd now like to include into the historical context and take some of the burden off of that justification if you're getting pushback on it. So it's just an opportunity to think about maybe reevaluating where you've had the most challenges or difficulty or time that you've spent, getting this approved and getting this checked off, and see if there's things that the tool can provide that reduce that burden.
And Steve, I guess it'd be fair to say that you can also, if you're comfortable with everything you're using, you can kind of do some stress testing by going in and changing some of those assumptions and seeing the effect of that without necessarily changing your base case assumptions. In other words, you can adjust something, the weighted average remaining life or the historical life or something, and see what the net effect of that, and be in effect stress testing just like we do for loan losses and capital and things like that.
It would actually work exactly that way, because you can pose the question, what kind of loss, what kind of reserve would I need if the world would be exactly like it was over the last 2 years? And then you could say, what kind of reserve would I need if it was like it was over this exact historical 5-year period in the past, without changing your warms or any of the other math? So there's a lot more ability to do with not a whole lot of extra work on your part, stress testing of the whole analysis and changing one thing at a time.
Yeah, and Sean, we certainly want to say, I know that everyone's been sipping water from a fire hose, getting through the implementation. So we don't want to set that bar, too high of all the things that you could do. But it is, once you get it implemented and you've got it running, I would circle back and make sure that my documentation or narratives that sort of explain your thought process, that those are in place. And then once I get that and I don't have anything else to do, we can go into the model and we can just say, hey, I want to stress test 2 things this quarter. And so, pick 2 things and see what happens to the reserve. And maybe, every quarter or every other quarter, maybe look at those pro formas. That's a best practice and helps you understand the model more and more. But again, Sean and Steve, I truly appreciate everything y'all have done. And I certainly appreciate all the hard work that all of our listeners have gone through just to get implementation. It doesn't have to be perfect first time around, but we can improve it as we go forward, as it evolves through.
I think that's exactly the sentiment I think that everybody should leave with, right? We worked very hard to get implemented and transitioned, what I think all of you have done quite successfully. But this will be an evolving process. And I think wherever we can, or you can improve your processes, you should try to. And then, like I said, we're going to try to continue to improve the tool to assist you in that manner. So thanks again to Paul and Steve for joining us today. Thanks to all of you for attending and listening. We'll be back next month, and we hope you all have a great weekend. See you later.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.